Thank you for being here. Thanks to the organisers for inviting me. I don't know how many of you work in urban planning, but that man does not sound like any transport planner I've ever met, and that's why I like working with him. I've had the privilege of working with Federico a few times, precisely because he doesn't think like a transport planner. And I think you'll find a lot of overlap in the things I'm about to talk about because we find ourselves aligned on a lot of the way that we approach sort of the future. What have I done? There we go. A lot of the questions around urbanism that I look at really relate to a simple idea, and it's an old idea. This idea that everything is in flux and change is the only constant. I think that for a long time we've looked at cities as something that gets built and is finished, and they've never been like that. Just like a landscape, cities are like an ecology. They're like a metabolism that grows, flows change, pulses in the city change. And so in a lot of ways we have to sort of look at transport the same way. It's not one thing that will remain that way the whole time. And so the trick with a lot of what we do in master planning is how do you design a transit system to change over time? I think also if we look at Dubai, Dubai has a unique position. It is developing in the space of a decade what cities in the West took hundreds of years to develop. But that has also opened up a series of possibilities. And so you see things like commitments by the government of Dubai to have 25% of trips by driverless modes of transport by 2030. That has been fleshed out in a way that is actually, when you look into it, it's not unrealistic. These are goals that are achievable. And really the interesting thing is that it's been looked at in terms of how much money will we save by doing this, rather than it's something worth doing for the sake of the future, but it's also an economic argument. And I think, again, you have to look at the totality of cities to understand what will happen to them in the future, and that includes looking at them from social and economic perspectives. A lot of the things we don't think about, particularly when we're looking at urban planning, is actually how much space in our cities is actually taken up by transport. What you see on the screen here is a view of Houston in the US. Basically, about 40% of our cities are occupied by streets, especially if we look at sort of downtown areas. About 20 to 30% of those areas is car parking. If you look at downtown areas of cities, it's been estimated that 30% of the cars in the downtown on the street are looking for a car space. So coming back to some of the things that Federico was talking about, if we start to look at mobility as a service, mobility that is potentially autonomous and not private, that sort of congestion goes away. And so how do we think about streets changing over time? How do we enable them to change over time? I'd done a simple parallel exercise in Dubai a while ago, and this is by the creek, just where the Dubai municipality offices are. About 62% of this area is car park and roads. And if you just simply take a low base price of land costs, that's 250 million dirhams worth of land that is occupied. So if you're wondering why would we bother looking at future mobility, well, there is an economic argument, there is significant sort of economic benefits, and there's city-making benefits. So in a lot of ways, there is no reason not to start looking at some of these opportunities. There is already many things that are in active development. If you look at the Hyperloop, which Federico touched on, and the way that it transitions to autonomous transport within cities, this is being looked at in a series of overlapping networks. What I find as an urban planner is that this has to be looked at also from the perspective of what the people of the city are doing. In the GCC in particular, you have a very young population. You've got a small population, but it's very wealthy and it's very young. Now, what does that mean in terms of transportation? Most of the millennials that I work with have a completely different view of mobility. They have a completely different view of ownership. And so when we sort of look at both global questions and local questions, this is where we have to look at this entire city, the whole puzzle, as a series of overlapping interdependent systems, and the people are the core of that system. If we look at it, the World Economic Forum has sort of played these kind of games of what will life be like in 2030, and this suggestion is ownership will disappear, mobility will be a service, accommodation will be a service, and so this sort of provocation that was, I think it was last year or so, it came out, was really this suggestion that we have to fundamentally reassess the way that ownership will affect cities as well. ACOM, the firm that I work with, has also been quite active in the development of future mobility, and the things that we're looking at just as a simple, basic set of opportunities include a whole series of things that are both here. And so when we look at e-cars or sharing of vehicles, it's already here. I'm literally every day when I park in the car park at the office, I see sharing vehicles there every single day. So it's a reality. It's as simple as peer-to-peer sharing, but it also includes mobility as a service, where you have an application that will give you access to a bike, a car, a autonomous vehicle. All of these things are things that are real, active, being developed. I'm sure you've all heard plenty about what Uber or Lyft or Google are doing in the space of mobility as a service. And so when we talk about future mobility, it's really multimodal in many different ways. And I think Federico sort of showed you a really good example of how that has an impact on the shape, the form of a city, the way that it connects to its hinterland. And it doesn't just relate to the way that we move, but also the way that goods move. And so the way that drones might transform our landscape will, again, have an impact on transit and the city. There is, I've just got a last couple of slides here where I just want to show that this is not fiction. And I mentioned before that Federico and I have worked together, and one of our recent projects was actually a revised master plan for the Dubai Design District. The work that we did at that point did more than double the built-up area in the design district, but it did so without increasing the roads and the public infrastructure in any way. And in a lot of ways, that was tied into a system of multimodal transport, of shared mobility, of autonomous vehicles, and the way that they might work within this district. So it's already happening. I think that most of you will have already heard plenty of things about Expo 2020, and in particular the legacy mode of Expo 2020, what happens after the event. This is just simply taken from the District 2020 website. What you see there is really, again, something that doesn't look like a lot of what Dubai looks like at the moment. You have at least 5 or 6 modes of transport there, a predominance of people. You can't really see a road. And so this idea of spaces in cities is rapidly changing, including here. And I think in a lot of ways our opportunity is that we're working in a place that is dynamic enough and ambitious enough to see this through. So as an introduction, I think that's from an urban perspective where I see mobility sort of moving.